I am based out of Maine, but I occasionally do cover other states in the New England area. And I know we have Kelly Gill, my supervisor, on who covers, for the time being, at least part of some of the New England states as well. So thanks for tuning in today. I'm going to be talking about pollinator seed mixes that you would probably be getting from myself or somebody in my position. And I'll be talking a little bit about what's typically included in those seed mixes and why we include those things. Let's see. Okay, great. So here's just a brief overview of where I'm going to be going today. I'm going to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. I think we have until 11, so plenty of time for questions at the end. And before I start too, I want to make it clear too, this isn't meant to be a webinar to make it so you don't ask myself or your Xerces partner biologist about pollinator mixes. It's just to kind of give everybody a little bit of information about what we will be providing to you as Xerces pollinator biologists. Or if you are making your own seed mixes, some things to keep in mind for that as well. And so first, I'm going to cover species selection in pollinator mixes. Then I will be going over the wildlife. Oh, and really quick, can everybody just go ahead and mute yourself too? I think we have one person we can kind of hear right now. Then I'll be covering the wildlife habitat planting 420 practice. I'm going to be focusing on the main specs, so they might differ depending on your state that you're in, but they should be fairly similar. I'll go over an example of a custom seed mix that I created for a planting here in Maine and go over some of the information that's included in that custom seed mix. I'm going to give an example of what a bargain bulk mix will typically contain also and show kind of why we don't usually want to use those types of mixes in our pollinator seed plantings. I'll briefly go over what you might find on a seed quote or tag that your growers might be giving you when you're looking for certification. And then I'll cover some factors in seed price as well. And as Jeremy said, there's a PDF of this PowerPoint available in the chat. So please feel free to follow along there if you want, and don't feel like you have to like rush and take notes or anything like that. All right, so with species selection, pollinator mixes will typically be pretty diverse. The reason for that is having multiple plant species will support different native pollinators, but diverse seed mixes also have some other benefits just beyond pollinator habitat. So it will increase the overall biodiversity and the functionality for other wildlife species as well. Having a diverse seed mix will definitely help with water interception and infiltration. You can see the deep roots of some of our native species there on this graph. Diverse mixes will also increase the resistance of plant invasion, much better than just a monoculture or a low diversity mix would. It'll definitely help with increasing drought tolerance. Again, looking at those deep root systems, being able to pull up water from the deep within the soil. And it'll also increase the stand longevity as well if we have a more diverse planting. And diversity will also typically mean a cheaper seed mix. It's kind of counterintuitive, but that's typically the case. It's not going to be, of course, as cheap as your, a pasture clover mix or something like that. But having a diverse seed mix will allow for the inclusion of a bit of some of the expensive seed. Sometimes like milkweed can get a little bit expensive. So in a diverse mix, we can include some of those species at a lower percentage. So we don't skyrocket the price, but still at least include those species in our mixes. So when we're looking at species selection, we of course want to match these species that we're picking for our mixes with the soil and moisture conditions that we're working with on the ground. And just so everybody's aware, NRCS and a lot of seed companies and vendors will typically have a little bit different language to describe the moisture needs of plants. That's just something to be aware of. So when we're looking at our web soil survey results and we might see that a site is well drained, seed companies would typically code that as mesic plants instead of like dry or dry mesic. So a little bit different language, something to keep in mind, maybe when you're talking to a grower or you're looking through a seed catalog or something with a grower. And when we select our species, we want to select species from different functional groups. Typically, we want to include at least one grass or sedge in a pollinator mix. That provides some nesting materials for bumblebees and stem nesters. Bunch grasses are typically favored in pollinator mixes since bumblebees will typically nest at the base of these clumps of these grasses. But we don't want to include too much grasses that will overtake the entire planting. We also want to include both legumes and non-legume forbs. Again, having those two groups will support different types of pollinators and beneficial insects. And there are definitely legumes available other than our just typical pasture clovers. So things like partridge pea, tick trefoils, lespedezas, those are all legumes that are great for pollinator plantings, and they're less aggressive than your red clovers, your white ladino clovers, those sorts of things. And they are going to be less likely to then take over an entire pollinator planting. And then, of course, we have tons of species of our non-legume forbs to choose from as well. And when we're looking at our non-legume forbs and trying to select those species, then we want to try to select some species from different plant families. Different native bees and butterflies will prefer or even require certain plant families. So including plants from a variety of plant families can really help support as many types of native bees and butterflies as possible. The first family that I have here is the aster family on the left. The aster family is enormous, and it's really easy to fill up a seed mix just, mainly with asters because it is such a big family. There's lots of important plants in this family, like our fall asters, like New England aster, those sorts of things. Goldenrods fall in the aster family, native thistles, Joe Pye weeds, a lot of plants fall within the aster family. But there's definitely other families to consider as well in our planting. The figwort family includes penstemon, which is a picture of this penstemon right here. That is an excellent early blooming plant to include in your mixes. I usually include one type of penstemon in every mix that I make if possible. The mint family here, that includes bee balms, monardas, mountain mints. These are a favorite of bumblebees. They are really easy to establish typically on a variety of soil types, so they're a great plant family to include. And then the dogbane family includes the host plant for monarch caterpillars, which is milkweed. And in New England, there are a few different species of milkweed that you can include as well. So these are not the only plant families that you can include, but these are some of the ones that you're likely going to be seeing in a lot of the pollinator mixes that'll cross your desk. And one of the biggest points that we often bring up in the field, especially to growers, is the need for blooms throughout the entire growing season. Early spring blooms are often lacking on the landscape, especially if there's no red maples or other early blooming trees and shrubs around. So making sure that we choose early blooming plants like yarrow, penstemon, golden alexanders, these types of plants will help fill in that early season spring bloom gap. This picture here is a spiderwort. Might not be great for Maine, but some of you in southern New England, maybe that might be a good choice for you. And then, of course, we have the other bloom seasons as well. So our early summer blooms, late summer blooms, and fall blooms. And we really want to try to include at least 3 species in each of these bloom periods if we can in our seed mixes, especially if they're not already present on the landscape. And we also want to select species with different life histories. We don't want to include a lot of biennials or annuals in the mixes because they will eventually be overtaken even if they do self-seed. But it is good to include a small percentage of annuals and biennials in the seed mix. It can really help with establishment, compete with weeds that first year after seeding, and just build grower confidence in general. A lot of you know, if you've already planned some pollinator habitat and seen pictures after that first year after seeding, the area typically looks a little weedy that first year. And that'll sometimes cause some growers to kind of panic and think they did something wrong or that the seeding was a failure. But if you can go out and point to them like, look, you have some partridge pea here, you have some black-eyed Susan here that's coming up, that'll really help boost confidence a little bit more in the planting. But then the bulk of the mixture should ideally be composed of short to long-lived perennials. And these are the species that it might take a few years to actually see, it might take a few years for them to actually germinate, but they will spread over time, they'll fill in gaps, they'll be much more competitive against invasive species, and they'll be more likely to persist over time. So we have a habitat that will persist for many years. All right, so after we've selected or have a good idea of our species, we want to make sure that we're following our NRCS-Maine specs. Again, this might be slightly different for different New England states, but should be kind of similar at least. And I'm using the wildlife habitat planning specs here. But most new pollinator plantings, if you're going to be using 420, will likely fall into a high diversity scenario. High diversity scenarios require a seeding rate of 40 to 60 pure live seeds, or PLS, per square foot. And in these scenarios, grasses must be less than 50% of the mix. And in a low diversity scenario, these low diversity scenarios can be really helpful if you're needing to fill in a specific bloom gap where maybe there's little to no early blooming species, but there's a lot of, maybe summer and late species that are already on the landscape. So targeting a bloom gap can be really helpful to use the low diversity scenarios. Or if you're just planning, something more targeted towards grassland wildlife as well, this scenario can be helpful. This scenario has a little bit lower seeding rate. It's 30 to 40 pure live seeds per square foot. And you can also have more than 50% grasses in this type of mix. However, if you're going to be utilizing a low diversity scenario for a pollinator area, I would still suggest using less than 50% grasses, just because we don't want the area to be completely overtaken by grasses. Grasses have a tendency to push out some of our forbs a little bit easier. Both scenarios require just a small percentage of annuals and biennials. So again, the bulk of the mix, regardless of the scenario, will probably be perennials. And both scenarios also require the use of mostly native species. Native meaning, ideally native to your state. If that's not possible, native to the New England region, and even wider than sometimes we'll have to go to the Northeast region in general. We really want to stick to that region. We definitely don't want to include a lot that is not native to North America in these scenarios. And then you'll notice that the specs use pure live seed, or PLS, per square foot instead of just seed per square foot or bulk seed. And there's a reason for that. Bulk seed has just a bunch of everything is in that bulk seed. It has extra stuff like dead seed, chaff, weed seed, just other species that we don't really want to be included in our mix. And that amount of extra stuff kind of varies from bulk lot to bulk lot. Bargain bulk mixes found at your typical big box stores will typically have just a lot of that extra stuff. So it makes it seem like the grower is getting a really great deal. The growers might gravitate towards those because it looks like they're getting a great deal. You might get, for instance, 6 pounds of that bargain bulk mix for half the cost of what it would cost for a custom mix. But really what you're paying for is just that inert matter, and even potentially worse, some weed seeds as well. So every bulk lot has a pure live seed percentage. And pure live seed, PLS, is just the live viable seed in a lot of bulk seed. And PLS is determined by the purity of the lot, so just the species that we actually want included and not weed seed, and then also the germination of the lot. So unless you have 100% pure live seed, 1 pound of bulk seed does not equal 1 pound of pure live seed. Pure live seed is typically always going to be less than your bulk seed. So seeding rates must be requested in terms of pure live seed from vendors in order to guarantee that our NRCS specs are met, because our NRCS specs are written in pure live seed. Lots of vendors, if they've worked with NRCS in the past, might automatically include the pure live seed percentage. Some might not. So it's really important to encourage growers when they're going to be ordering their seed to ask that the vendors give them quotes or write their seed tags in terms of pure live seed, or at least give both the bulk and the pure live seed weights and percentages. And you'll also notice that the specs don't mention anything about the number of pounds of seed that we apply per acre. This is because the weights of different species vary dramatically. And since we're going to be including a diverse seed mix with many different species, it doesn't really make sense to make specs in terms of the weight, because depending on what species you include, those weights of the seeds are going to really be changing. You can see here in these pictures that black-eyed Susan seeds are much, much smaller compared to partridge pea seeds. There's going to be a lot more seed in a 5-pound bag of black-eyed Susan compared to a 5-pound bag of partridge pea. And just anecdotally, I found that when I create wet mixes for like riparian areas or wetlands, these mixes are typically lighter in weight than dry upland mixes, even when both have the same seeding rate of 40 seeds per square foot. So that just means that the species that I've chosen in our wet mixes have smaller, lighter seeds than the upland species in general. And this is just another illustration of seed size and weight difference. So this is why we have to specify the number of pure live seeds per square foot that we want in our seed mix. It makes a lot more sense for us to look at just the number of seeds that are going to be on the ground in a given square foot than the weight of the seeds, because they vary so much between species. All right, so this is a custom mix that I made for a planting near Farmington, Maine. This is in zones about 4 on the hardiness scale. The area has generally pretty well-drained soil, so I didn't include species with high water needs. But I'm just going to kind of walk us through what's all included here and showing you how they meet NRCS specs. So here in this mix, there are mostly native species to the Northeast region. There's going to be native species blooming in the spring, early summer, late summer, and fall. This site already has a lot of goldenrod and some asters present, so the seed mix really focuses on that spring and summer species blooms. We have a lot of different plant families present. We have aster, figwort, carrot, mint, milkweed, pea, and grass families. And we did include little blue stem as the grass here. It is only 10% of the mix though, so less than that 50% grass spec for the high diversity scenario. This site is also on an old pasture, so there's likely going to be some cool grasses that are at least around the planting, if not in the planting itself. So we just wanted to include a smaller amount of grass so grasses don't overtake our forbs here. The mix is also mostly perennials. Black-eyed Susan and partridge pea are the 2 annuals or biennials that make up this mix. That's only, those 2 combined are only 9% of the seed mix in terms of number of seeds per square foot. And the percent mix column, you'll see, is in terms of number of pure live seeds per square foot, and again, not in pounds per acre. This is, again, just because seed sizes vary between species. And the next column, pure live seeds per square foot, is just the number of seeds of each species in any given square foot. So it just kind of translates the percentages to actual number of seeds in a given square foot. And at the bottom here in that red rectangle, that's the total of the number of seeds per square foot, and that should match the NRCS specs, which in this case is a high diversity seeding scenario, so it's 40 to 60 pure live seeds per square foot, so this is right smack in the middle at 50 pure live seeds per square foot. I will typically recommend seeding at 50 to 60 pure live seeds per square foot if we're going to be planting in an area where vegetation is currently growing, just because even if you get a pretty good site prep, there might be some weed pressure that we want to make sure we have plenty of seeds on the ground to kind of help combat that. And also another reason for kind of upping that seeding rate to 50 pure live seeds per square foot is that a lot of folks, especially with pollinator plantings, are going to be broadcasting their seed instead of drilling. So, you know, when you broadcast, you might get some seed that blow away or wash away, or it might not even reach the soil surface if there's some vegetation residue left at the ground. So using a little bit higher seeding rate is typically a little bit better for that type of situation. And the pounds of pure live seed per acre column, which is that next column there, basically just translates the number of pure live seeds per square foot column into weight and acres. So there's math here between these two columns that takes into account the weight and size of the seed of each species, and it translates into the actual weight. So we can take a look here at the perennial blanket flower and wild bergamot. They both have the same percentage of the seed mix in terms of number of seeds per square foot, 6%. If we look in the actual number of seeds per square foot, they should each have in any given square foot 3 seeds per square foot. But then we look at the weights and we can tell that they are much different in terms of their size. So the perennial blanket flower is going to have a little bit larger, heavier seeds than our wild bergamot. So it's important that we can see both the number of pure live seeds and then this column, the pounds of pure live seeds per acre. These are typically the numbers that vendors are going to be using when they actually fulfill the request for the seed mix. So this column, again, just shows us how many pounds of each species will be seeded on each acre. And the total of this column is the total number of pounds of seed mix per acre, where that blue arrow is. And again, it's really important that the grower requests pure live seed for pounds specified here, because we just want to, for our weight that we're ordering, we just want the weight of the actual seeds that we want to plant. We don't want to include any weight of weed seed or chaff, things like that. And the landowner will need to order the mix based on this pounds of pure live seed per acre number. So for 1 acre, this landowner 2.68 pounds if they're going to seed for a whole acre. But this planting is pretty small. It's just 1/10 of an acre. So the landowner would really only need to order 0.63 pounds of this mix. And for this seed mix, it would cost about $350 to $400 per acre. But at 1/10 of an acre, if they could only order what they needed to seed, it would cost about $35 to $40. So that's kind of what you would see on a typical seed mix. If you're in Maine, this is the exact layout that I would give to you. Other states probably going to have a very similar layout. So here's an example of a bargain bulk mix that I've seen submitted by growers a few times for a pollinator planting. The pictures look really great on the website and the price looks even better. I mean, remember the custom mix that I just showed you? It was about $350 for six pounds of seeds. And here it looks like you could get 5 pounds of seed for only $184. But then when we start to take a closer look at the information that's given, things start to fall apart pretty quickly here. First, you'll see that there are no percentages, number of seeds, weights, or anything like that for individual species. So we don't really know how much of each species is in here. And the actual seed bags and packets don't give you this information either. So we don't really know what the breakdown is. I mean, the seed mix could be top loaded with a bunch of, red corn poppy, and we really don't know the breakdown or anything. So right away, it's going to be really tough for us to check to see if the seed mix meets NRCS number of seeds per square foot specifications. And next that we can see that there are 18 species in this seed mix, but 7 to 9 of them are annual or biennials, just kind of depending on the area that you're at. Some might act as perennials or annuals. Because we don't know the percentage breakdown of the seed mixes, this could be anywhere from 10% of the entire mix are annuals or biennials to 75%. Again, we don't have that breakdown of percentages to know how much is an annual or how much are perennials. Annuals are typically cheaper seeds than perennials, so I would be willing to guess that a big percentage of this mix is filled with annuals, which is not really in accordance to NRCS 420 specs. And there are only about 6 natives on this list, and that's natives kind of being generous, meaning that native east of the Rockies too. So definitely not majority native seeds here. The website here also says that this mix is suitable for all USDA hardiness zones. We don't really have, we don't have anything specifically in our specs that have to, you have to match the hardiness zones, but it's just another red flag for me when I see this. It tells me that the mix probably doesn't include a lot of species that are native to New England or Maine. If it does equally well in Florida as it does in Maine, I have questions about that. And finally, the website actually recommends seeding this mix at 25 pounds of seed per 1 acre. So that works out to about $924 to seed for 1 acre. It's definitely not the bargain that we thought. The custom mix on the previous slide was anywhere from $350 to $450 per acre. So I don't know if this is because, there might be a lot of extra chaff, weed seed, just inert material here, but you're going to need to seed a lot more of this bargain bulk mix if you want to get a good coverage. And even then with the, the non-natives in here, you're probably still not even going to be meeting NRCS specifications. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're talking with growers, is that those bargain bulk mixes that they might be seeing are really not bargains. All right, and then when your landowners does submit a seed mix to a vendor for quotes, hopefully they'll give you something like this back just to double check that everything still meets specs. This is a seed quote here from a mix that was made in Maine a couple years, or last year, I believe. This quote gives information both in bulk quantity in pounds and pure live seed quantity in pounds, which is great. So we have our pure live seed here. We can also see from the 2 columns that the pure live seed quantity is always less than the bulk quantity. Again, just because they're taking out that extra filler stuff that isn't actually live seed that we want. Quotes and tags are typically broken down based on 1 pound of the seed mix. But remember, though, the landowner will have to order the right amount of pure live seed pounds per acre. So this original mix recommended seeding at a rate of 5.59 pounds of pure live seed per acre. So they would just have to order that amount of that mix. This is only quoted for 1 pound. And you'll see here that substitutions, this seed mix had substitution requests from the vendor. Those will always happen. Depending on the time of year you might have more or less. 1 or 2 substitutions probably shouldn't affect the seed mix that much, but when you get to be several in the seed mix and a quote, you'll just want to check to make sure that the seed mix actually still meets the specs. Or you can give it to me or your partner biologist or your state biologist to help you figure out if those still meet specs even with those substitutions. And this is just a side-by-side comparison of the original custom mix on the left compared to the seed quote on the right. Again, there were a lot of substitutions, and we actually went back to make sure that the specs were still being met, and they were. Substitutions just kind of changed the species that we had in the mix. So if you ever run into a situation with a lot of substitutions, again, feel free to reach out to me, your Xerces partner biologist. I know it can be a real headache for offices to deal with, especially during the busy field season. So I'm definitely here to take that extra work off of you. But if you are interested and you want to check the substitutions yourself, I have a couple tools that I've made for my own use that I'd be happy to walk people through with that as well. There's just a few different ways that you can check to make sure substitutions will still meet specs. All right, and last, I just want to cover some factors that can cause seed to be either inexpensive or expensive. So inexpensive seed typically, an inexpensive species, typically have a shorter life cycle. So as I mentioned, that annuals and biennials will typically be less expensive just because they have a shorter life cycle. They'll seed and flower usually within the first 1 or 2 years that they're planted. So you can collect the seed a lot faster. They're easier to germinate. They're pretty common species, are typically inexpensive. Usually if seed species are popular or in demand, they can be inexpensive. However, if all of a sudden there's a huge demand for a species and the supply doesn't meet it, that might cause the price to increase a little bit. Small, hard seed is typically easier to harvest. It's easier to clean. And species with less shatter, which just means that the seed is retained on the seed head longer, is just, again, easier to collect. So that makes it a little bit less expensive of a species. And a big factor that can cause seed mixes overall to be less expensive is ordering the seed mix right after a vendor restocks. And that'll typically be in the spring. So I would definitely recommend, if you have a person that's going to be seeding their pollinator mix in the fall, ask them to get the seed in the spring and just store it in the right kind of cool, dry, dark conditions until they seed in the fall. They'll typically be getting a better price because the seed vendors will have the quantity in stock that everybody needs. Some factors that can cause seed to be a little bit more expensive with the growing amount of super weeds or weeds that are kind of more resistant to herbicides. That means that there's higher likelihood of weeds invading companies' planting areas. So they'll need to do additional testing for weed seed to avoid spreading those invasive weeds. And reputable seed vendors will always be able to tell you the percent of weed seeds in a mix. So that's really important to look for also. That's a mark of a very reputable vendor, is having that weed seed percentage testing. Species rarity. Obviously, if species are rare, it's going to be harder to grow and there's just going to be less supply. Difficult germination requirements, things with the seeds that require them to be hand harvested. Those are all factors that can cause species to be a little bit more expensive. And then seed pests as well. If there's a plant that has a big seed pest, it's going to be harder to actually create the supply needed for the demand. And again, ordering your seed late in the year, typically before the new year, right before the new year in the winter, can cause seed mixes in general to be a little bit more expensive because companies, vendors are running out of their supply. So you want to best wait, maybe get quotes at different times of the year. But I would definitely suggest trying to get your seed mixes ordered right after vendors restock in the spring. So in general, here are just some take-home points that I hope everybody can get out of this webinar today. First, when we're looking at our species to include in pollinator mixes, we want to have a diverse species mix and have different functional groups represented, as well as different plant families represented as well, to support a variety of native pollinators. We also want to have bloom coverage throughout the entire season: spring, early summer, late summer, and fall. Really want to impress on our growers to ask for things in pure live seed, because again, we want them to only be paying for the seed that they actually need on the ground and not be paying extra for a bunch of bulk mix, chaff and weed seeds that we don't want necessarily. Also remember, with that pure live seed, that NRCS specs are in terms of pure live seeds, number of pure live seeds per square foot, not in terms of pounds per acre. Also impress on your growers that bargain mixes really are not bargains. They're likely going to have to buy a lot more pounds of that seed to actually get a good coverage. So you're going to be spending more in the long run. And also, of course, please reach out with questions if you have questions about substitution in your mixes. If you need some custom mixes made, please reach out to myself or your Xerces partner biologist, your state biologist. we're here to help you out with pollinator mixes. And so with that, I think we have about 40 minutes for questions, or 20 minutes, sorry, for questions. But here's my contact information, and please feel free to reach out to me if you have questions. Thanks.
Great, Hannah. That was fantastic. A lot of good information about ordering seeds and also how to get a wildflower meadow established. So I've been looking at the chat box, and I did see there were some comments in the chat box about the inability to download the presentation. So
Okay.
I think we'll just send out an email after the webinar, and we'll include the recording as well as the PDF of this presentation. So Hannah, you did get a couple of questions. The first question that came in was from Sarah, and Sarah asks, Xerces worked with Ernst Seed Company to make a pollinator seed mix. Information on the Ernst page does not give pure live seed information. Can I assume that this meets the pure live seed square foot NRCS requirements?
Yeah, that's a great question. Usually I would still suggest getting a quote so you can see just for yourself on the seed quote the percentage of pure live seed that they're going to have, because that will vary from bulk lot to bulk lot. Like they'll pre-mix that entire seed mix. And just depending on the lot that you're drawing from, it'll have a slightly different percentage. But yes, if you, I believe that those mixes were made with NRCS specs in mind. So as long as they give you the pure live seed percentages in your quote or on your seed tag, I believe you should be able to assume that they would meet NRCS specs, as like assuming too that you're working off of the high diversity scenario, I believe.
Great. We have another question, and the question is, if seeds are to be drilled, should they be ordered separately by species due to different seed sizes, weights?
Yeah, great question. Yes, definitely at least order separately the fluffy seed and the hard seed, because if you're drilling, you should be using a native seed drill, which will then have a separate box for your fluffy seed like grass seed and some other wildflower seeds, and the smaller seeds. So yep, that'll prevent everything from just being dumped in one location. Yep, great question. And that's a really easy thing for vendors to do. And you can even ask for that too if you want, if you're still going to be broadcasting, if you want to do like maybe more filler to bulk up the mix when you're actually broadcasting. If you want to do 2 separate passes with your fluffy seed and your hard seed, you can still ask for them to be separate too.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat box.
Okay.
So if there are any other questions out there, please unmute yourself and feel free to ask a question. All right. Well, fantastic, Hannah. I think this was a great presentation, and a lot of really good information too, especially this stuff can get so confusing. So I really appreciate the time of, oh, looks like we do have a couple questions coming in. So here's one. Kelly had made a comment. It says the Ernst mixes shown online are bulk. You can request the mix in pure live seed when ordering. I have been working with Ernst to include pure live seed on their online spec, so hopefully that info will be added soon. Cool. Thanks for making that note, Kelly. And then so we have another question is there a list of recommended vendors? Clients in Vermont usually use Ernst.
Yep. So I have a list of just vendors. We don't recommend anybody specifically to keep it fair. but I can send out the list that I have. I believe, Jeremy, they might be included on our Maine's job sheet. I can't remember if we included them on the 420 job sheet or not. But if folks need that, though, I can send out what I have, and Kelly might have some other sources, maybe in southern New England or the Northeast as well. I can send that out if that's needed.
Yeah, maybe we can send that out. That would be great.
Yeah, but Ernst is one that people in Maine typically use as well, and have had very good results with them. So yeah.
All right, so we have a hypothetical question here. I was contacted by a landowner that requested species substitution because of the price. Her seed mix was available, but she just wanted to save money. Is this acceptable to NRCS and Xerces?
I mean, I think it's kind of on a case-by-case basis. I wouldn't want anybody to, not be able to participate because it's cost prohibitive. I will say that in the 420 specs or the 420 scenarios, there's a lot more cost share available for seed mixes itself. So it's an upfront cost, but the seed mix cost share will typically cover a lot more than if in the past using like 327 or something like that. I've made substitutions for folks that it's cost prohibitive for them. I think that's completely fine as long as it still meets NRCS specifications. I think that's completely fine. Jeremy, I don't know if you have any other.
Yeah, I totally agree, Hannah. As long as we can meet our specifications and meet the standard requirements, then yeah, definitely. Okay, great questions. Anything else? Anybody else have a question? All right. Well, thank you, Hannah. This was fantastic. Thanks for looking into all this information about seed mixes and specs. And I know the planners here in Maine really appreciate the work that you do, and also your availability to meet with them and the clients they work with. So thank you so much. And again, thanks everyone for joining the call. Like I said, we'll send out a email with a link to this recording, and then we'll also provide some attachments too that were discussed in the call. So
thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you.